Good day. My name is Charles Kidega Ochaya. I'll give you a presentation on green logistics. Well, we first need to understand what green logistics is. And this diagram shows the relationships that bring forth the importance of green logistics. One needs to appreciate the relationship between planet, people, and profitability. This is the popular triple P model, in which they say that the three components that have been shown in this diagram are all interconnected. If you do not take care of the planet, then whatever business you are doing will not be sustainable. So profitability alone, chasing profitability alone is not good enough for a practice to be sustainable. And sustainability speaks to the idea that something can persist and exist for a long time. In other words, if a business is sustainable, it should not only last for a few years, but it should last for several years, for generations to come. So if you ignore planetary condition, environment, and you pollute the environment, eventually it will affect the lives of the people. The health of the workers also will be affected, to such an extent that even the very same profits that you are pursuing will not accrue in future, because everyone will be sick and they will not be able to perform properly. So therefore, the three components are interconnected, and you need to take cognizance of all those three factors. Now, this module is about green logistics. Some of the components we need to look at include green purchasing, green productivity, green marketing, and green management. And these are the elements that you need to take care of in order to protect the environment, in order to have a sustainable business. Also, we need to appreciate that there is an emergence of a new market, which is the green market. And for companies to survive in this market, they need to go green in all aspects of their business. So this simply means that people are becoming more aware of green issues. Sometimes they'll even go to the extent of buying products that have been labeled to be environmentally safe. And there are also lobby groups that try to promote or discourage companies that are not going green. Now, green purchasing, which is an aspect within the supply chain, involves the organization, planning, and controlling of recycling, reclaimed materials, and reclaim centers that are designated as green. Okay. So when you do green purchasing, you make sure that you comply with the green regulations. You buy products that have been labeled as being green, made using green materials, and so on. And that is the idea behind green purchasing. There's also what is known as EPP, which stands for Environmental Preferable Purchasing. It's another term that is used to refer to green purchasing. This is the affirmative selection and acquisition of products and services that most effectively minimize negative environmental impacts over the life cycle of manufacturing, transportation, use, recycling, or disposal. So when you're dealing with environmentally preferable purchasing, you need to look at the supply chain, the diagram that you're so familiar with, where you have, on the one hand, you have procurement, transportation of those procured materials, raw materials, to the processing centers, the manufacturing centers, which are the factories, and then from the factories, the final products have to be distributed. They have to be transported to the buyers. Then you have the reverse cycle where you have to deal with the disposal of waste. At each point within the supply chain, waste is produced. Okay, there is always a byproduct of some sort that will emanate from the process. If you can imagine, in the process of procuring raw materials, obviously there will be some kind of transportation involved, right? And of course, that automatically means that the carbon emissions will have to happen. In the process of storage in the warehouses, you also have to consider that you have to maybe provide heating, you need to use electricity, and so on. So in some way, you are also influencing the level of the global heating. Okay, the atmosphere is also affected, right? So some of the environmentally friendly practices include the following. There are services that conserve energy and water, that minimize generation of waste and the release of pollutants. Okay, services that conserve energy, energy efficient services. You don't use so much petroleum, for example. You use bulbs that don't provide too much output in terms of energy. Okay, and also processes that use less water, because water, as you know, also is a scarce resource. The other point is products made from recycled materials that can be used or recycled. So this practice also is highly encouraged. It's whereby the very same products that you're using are using recycled materials. If you're using maybe cardboard boxes, that could have been manufactured from waste boxes that were used before in the packaging of materials. So that's an example of a recycled product. Waste paper that was recycled, and now you have card boxes. Right? Another practice which is encouraged is the use of renewable resources such as bio-based fuels, solar power, and wind power. Right? There's an example in Egypt where there's a plant that there's an area from which solar power is generated. It's in the desert, and they've got so many panels where they generate so much electricity from solar, from the sun. Wind power also, I know that in some places in Europe, along the coast, it will be very, very windy, and these winds can drive windmills. Okay, you might have seen this on TV or someplace where windmills, they look like propellers from an aircraft. So many of them would be laid out along the coast in some kind of farm, and then that drives some motors and generators and generates electricity from there. Also, alternative fuel vehicles that do not use so much petroleum, are encouraged. This is an attempt to reduce the level of carbon emissions into the atmosphere. Okay. Now, this diagram tries to give a snapshot of the various concerns of supply chain management. It's a holistic approach to dealing with green logistics or green supply chain. From the point of designing the product that you design must be designed to be environmentally friendly. Okay, the design should be not something that will affect the environment in a negative way. After that, you now go and source for raw materials in order to build the item that you've designed, whether it's a car, an electric car, or whatever. But you now need to go and use or buy raw materials that will be used to make or build that car. Now there comes the point of environmentally friendly purchasing. Purchase from suppliers who will supply you products which have been manufactured in an environmentally friendly way. So you should prefer those suppliers who will provide you products that have been certified to be environmentally friendly. When you manufacture, also the manufacturing process in the factories have to be environmentally friendly. If in a factory there's so much emission of soot, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, like you used to see in the olden days from chimneys, that is not what is recommended under green management. Right? So prefer to use methods that reduce the emissions of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and nitrous compounds and sulfur compounds into the atmosphere, because these will negatively impact on our health, human health. It will also damage, it will increase the GHG, the greenhouse gases, which will create a blanket and increase global warming. Right? So we want to reduce global warming by doing the right things in the manufacturing process. Right? Now you have produced your product, you need to package it. Then again, you need to use products that are green, that do not use plastics, for example. Prefer to use paper bags or wrappers, which are actually less harmful to the environment. The problem with plastics, as you know, obviously, one of them is that it is not biodegradable. Once you've produced plastics, it will just be floating around, blocking rivers, and even being, consumed by animals to the detriment of their health. So we need to package in a sensible way. Now, thereafter comes green transportation. The logistical issues have to be dealt with. We need to transport efficiently to minimize the number of miles, carbon miles that will be consumed or used up. So it has to be strategic. The whole delivery process from the factory to the final consumer, the final user, is a logistical issue, but a lot of greening has to be done in order to make the transportation efficient, minimize the costs, minimize the miles, use petroleum which is not unleaded petroleum, minimize the use of diesel. So these are some of the considerations pertaining to green transportation. Now, once the product has been used, there is waste that is produced, but the question is, can reverse logistics be applied? How do you dispose of this waste? Do you just dump it? Once it's used up, you just dump it somewhere, or do you try to recycle the waste in some way? Even if the product is completely, or the byproduct is completely unusable, the way it's disposed matters for the environment. Okay, if you have a pile up of rubble left or dumped somewhere, this also can block the riverways, the waterways, and that creates problems in the water levels at the dams. Now, we need to focus on the issue of transportation. As you know, transportation is a major culprit, if I could say it that way, is a major culprit in the production of GHG, in the production of greenhouse gases. In the UK, for example, a study shows that most of the carbon dioxide, to the tune of 96%, come from road transportation in the UK. So it gives you an idea of the level of emissions that emanate from transportation alone. But now the interesting thing that they also note in that study is that carbon emission from road transportation can be significantly reduced at little or no net cost. So here it's a question of effort. If companies could make an effort, it does not affect the level of sales that they can accrue. Remember, companies are trying to maximize profits. The more they can deliver, the more they can transport, the more they distribute, the more the customers actually get access to the product. However, if this whole process can be done more efficiently, then you will still get the same amount of revenue that you would have gotten without any additional cost to your business. Because of the importance of carbon dioxide, we need to do carbon auditing. In fact, there's an institute called Carbon Reduction Institute, CRI, which tries to audit or to understand the level of emissions that emanate from transportation. Not only to understand that, they also want to try and audit and account for the emissions into the atmosphere. Right? They would also be talking about things like carbon footprint, that is to examine the level of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that are emitted into the atmosphere in 1 year or in any given financial year. So when this CRI institute wants to audit, they will be discussing issues around carbon footprint auditing, right? Which is actually how much carbon dioxide is emitted into the atmosphere in a given financial year. And the measurement, the metric, is the number of kilograms of carbon dioxide. So everything is compared to the number of kilograms of carbon dioxide that is emitted. Now there are two ways or two approaches to measuring carbon emissions from freight operations, from transportation. One is called the fuel-based approach. The other one is known as the activity-based approach. Now, as for the fuel-based approach, there will be direct measurements of fuel use. For example, readings from fuel gauges or storage tanks. Financial records on fuel expenditures have to be examined. And then, where there is no data available, reports on fuel expenditures can be converted into fuel consumptions. And thereby they will be able to calculate or compute how much carbon dioxide emission is matching the amount of fuel expenditures. So here you can see, by examining the usage of fuel, petroleum, petrol, those who are doing the auditing are able to estimate how much one company or a company contributes to the total amount of carbon dioxide in the environment. And of course, they do that by checking the gauges, the readings, and the financial records. Okay. Now the other is the activity-based approach. They want to understand the level of activity and the type of vehicle that is being used. So data on activity level by vehicle type will be needed. This kind of information will actually be extracted from company records. And of course, as you know, companies would have dispatch records. When they send out someone to maybe deliver a product somewhere, there will be a note written. A dispatch note has to be filled. The driver has to sign what they're delivering, and then the time. They will indicate the time when they left. Okay, and then when the commodity arrives at its destination, someone will be there to receive that, who will also sign and give a receipt. It's just a little bit like when DHL delivers a product, you need to sign and also indicate that you've received the product. So these records are there somewhere within the company records, and then it's a matter of retrieving them, analyzing them, compiling and analyzing them. Then you would have an idea of perhaps also the number of miles covered. All right, and again, it's not only about road transportation. Any activity that can yield carbon emissions or carbon dioxide emissions it will have to be audited as well. Now, the importance of gross vehicle weight is that when the vehicle is very heavy, obviously like trucks, there's a lot of, they're slow, they use so much petroleum and they emit so much GHG, greenhouse gases. So one needs to consider what to use. Should you use lighter vehicles, smaller vehicles, but many of them, or should you use a few large horse and trailers to deliver your products? Well, there is a trade-off there. That statement is trying to tell you that there is a trade-off. Whereas we are using heavier trucks but covering less numbers of trips, the emissions will be higher for heavier trucks. But for the smaller, lighter vehicles, you have to use many of them to deliver the same amount of commodities or the same number of goods, but then you need to use many lighter vehicles over many trips. So then the question is, which one is more efficient? You see, would you rather use fewer miles but heavier emissions of carbon dioxide, or many miles but each car or smaller truck emitting less carbon dioxide? So there's a trade-off there, and the data or the studies research shows that it might actually be better to use fewer heavier vehicles than many lighter vehicles. Now we need to understand some of the barriers to green purchasing. We are now trying to zero in on organizational aspects and what it is that can be done in order to address supply chain, greening of the supply chain. Now, the barriers to green purchasing include knowledge of green issues within an organization, organizational green issues such as clear strategic goals. Also, the idea that greening of the supply chain is a very costly exercise. This tends to discourage many companies because they perceive that costs will be very high, falsely or maybe truly so, but it's just a perception from their side. Also, you have sometimes the lack of legislation in some places where they are not actually alive to the problems of greenhouse gases. Then also supplier issues. So broadly speaking, these are the areas which have been classified, the areas that have been identified as creating barriers to green purchasing. Now, very quickly, knowledge of green issues. Obviously, for you to implement a green strategy, you need to have people who understand green issues. Okay, they need to understand the environmental impacts of products. They need to understand ideas around green purchasing. Okay, they should be conversant with green issues. It pays to have someone who has this kind of knowledge within an organization, and especially management level. Okay. The next one is, from an organizational standpoint, senior management need to buy in. They need to be supportive of ideas of green initiatives. They should incorporate green initiatives in strategic goals. Okay, and also they should also engage green professionals, green competent professionals. Now, from the standpoint of perceptions of costs and benefits, because management often believe that greening supply chains is a costly exercise, there will be lack of financial support. So any program that is not driven by, that has no financial support, will likely not succeed. The management also may have a perception that they may question the worth of green products. Are they really worth it? Is it really worth investing in this kind of venture where you are away from the traditional approaches? Also, when it comes to legislation, government legislation, sometimes, like I said already, legislation might be lacking or it might be deficient in some way, and it may also not be enforceable. So enforceability also matters. Then supplier issues. As you know, the idea within the supply chain is actually to create a link between also the producer, the manufacturer, and the supplier of raw materials. So the supplier also, from the supplier's point of view, they have to be aware of green possibilities. They have to also come on board this idea of using green products in their own processes, so that when the company now buys from the supplier, they will be buying products that have been certified to be environmentally safe. And then when they use these products in their own processes, they will be producing products which are environmentally friendly. So all along the supply chain, all the partners have to be on board, and they all have to do or initiate programs that encourage environmentally safe practices. So we can now briefly summarize some of the key principles when we are dealing with, for example, green purchasing. The first principle, you need to consider whether a product is needed before purchasing it or not. So, as obviously, this is an obvious point where the procurement officer needs to ensure that the product is needed. If you procure materials that are not needed, you are putting pressure on the environment. Obviously, you have to do some logistical issues. You need to procure, you need to transport, and so on. So the question is, can you eliminate the use of a certain product? If you can, then go ahead and eliminate it. The second principle is you should purchase a product considering the various environmental impacts over its life cycle, from extraction to disposal. So as you buy the product, you must be knowledgeable of the whole process over the whole life cycle of the product. Okay, how it's going to be, where is it, how is it manufactured, how you will use it, how is it disposed, and so on. Okay. And if at all there are any reverse cycles that are there to deal with issues around waste disposal. The third principle is to select suppliers who make conscious efforts to care for the environment. So as a procurement officer, you need to be selective in those who supply you with your products and biased towards those who are also implementing schemes that are environmentally friendly. The fourth principle is that you should collect environmental information on products and suppliers. In other words, try to have a database or look for databases which are there on companies that are compliant with environmental standards. Let us consider the construction sector with regard to green logistics. We know that the construction sector is a very large contributor to greenhouse gases emissions, and it uses so many non-renewable materials, water in abundance, and it generates wastes in the form of rubble and other materials which are left over after the construction project is done. Now, because of construction, you find its impact will be felt in terms of logistics, in terms of transportation, packaging of materials, and the use of trucks to carry materials to site and away from site. So it's a very, very large contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, directly or indirectly. So before we can talk about green buildings, we need to also look at the materials that are used in the construction of green buildings. The idea being that when you certify a building to be okay, compliant with green standards, even the materials that were used in building that structure should have been green in the first place. The United Nations Environmental Program, together with the Institute for Sustainable Building and Climate Initiative, have formed a partnership. So this partnership is the UNEP-SBCI. It brings together companies, governments, non-governmental organizations, research centers, institutions, and so on, in a common forum with common interests, which is actually to enhance environmental programs and make sure that we have sustainable environmental agenda. Thus, it promotes the universal adoption of practices to improve the efficient use of resources and energy efficiency in buildings. UNEP-SBCI undertakings include being a knowledge center. In other words, this organization or this partnership wants to be a knowledge resource center where all the partners, all the stakeholders can find information, they can review work that has been done, research that has been done on this area of construction and how it affects the environment. It also provides a forum for contractors, construction companies. They also have a UNEP finance initiative in order to try and strategize on green funding. They also try to standardize the way construction is done so that it's no longer haphazard. They have to have common standards to which all the participants in the construction industry can abide by. UNEP-SBCI also encourages green purchasing. In other words, they want policymakers to consider green purchasing in their activities pertaining to procurement and other policy matters. In summary, when we talk about green building, it means that we have to take account of the way energy is being used. A building which is green would have optimized the use of energy so that the carbon emissions will be much lower, and also the heat generated through, for example, storing in warehouses would also be much lower. So it's an intelligent approach to the use of energy, or to the level of energy emissions. Green buildings must also safeguard water resources. In other words, make sure that there is no wastage of potable water, and it should be efficiently used as well. In doing this green building, they must make sure that waste is minimized. Okay, and if at all there are some leftover materials, we must find a way of reusing them. Remember the 3 R's in green logistics. It should also promote health and well-being. In other words, these green buildings must be safe. Okay, they must be safe and ensure that it's habitable. People can live there as well. Green buildings should also be good, well landscaped. It should not be some structure which is alien and interfering with the landscape, the habitat. It should be compatible. It should merge well with the habitat in which it has been built. And also, green buildings must have resilient structures. In other words, they should be strong and should not be weak, and they should therefore be safe. So finally, on this green building, it must obey all the stages of the building life cycle, from the point of conceiving the idea of the building to the point of drawing up the architectural blueprint, to the point of procurement of the materials, to the point of actually building the structure, and even to the point of occupancy. When people now move in, it should also be in such a way that their very same activities or the leases that they've signed should not be harmful to the environment. Now, within an organization, when you try to examine those who are influential or the levels of decision making, you can identify decisions that are commercial at the commercial level, at the top level, decisions that are at the functional, departmental levels, decisions that are operational decisions. These are the frontline, day-to-day decisions that have to be made. Okay, so commercial decisions can affect product sourcing, where you get the products from, where you procure from. It can affect subcontracting of processes, outsourcing. You know, companies sometimes will outsource and give subcontracts to some other companies to do part of their work so that they can focus on their core competencies. Okay. So those are commercial level decisions, and it's actually senior managers, those at board level, who can make this kind of commercial decisions. Then at the functional level, they will be dealing with logistical resources. Okay. The managers at this level have discretion over the choice, the routing, the loading of vehicles, and so on. If the manager is dealing with perhaps distribution, then they have an influence on the route that has to be followed, the kind of vehicles, how you load them. Is it fully loaded? Is it half loaded? And so on. And so on. And also decisions within warehouses can be made at the functional level. Operational decisions include the scheduling of production, distribution, that translate the trading links into discrete freight flows, the rate of inventory rotation in warehouses. So these are front line kind of decisions, and they're also very important things to do with scheduling, who does what, when, and how, and the numbers involved. A study has also shown that there has been a tendency for firms to confine green initiatives to the bottom end of the decision-making hierarchy. Such include functional level initiatives such as truck fuel efficiency, backloading, vehicle routing, and energy conservation in warehouses. So, well, whereas this is important when you're considering, say, the usage of fuel, scheduling of the trips, the number of trips, loading of the vehicles, and the routes taken to deliver, say, petroleum and so on. Top level decision making that are very, very important are often not taken on board. In other words, decisions that are at the operational level tends to supersede those at the top level. So therefore management has to make an effort to also incorporate into their management plans strategic initiatives on how to do strategic greening the logistics. Finally, we'll look at urban consolidation centers. This is a concept someone has come up with, where the idea is to try and minimize delivering laws into urban areas. This is done by providing facilities near urban centers, near towns, where all the warehousing is done away from towns, and delivery into towns now will be done in a more efficient way. So this idea of an urban consolidation center, where you consolidate, you bring everything, all the trucks converge into one area, an area that has been set, a zone that has been set aside to cater for all this, and then the needed facilities will be there, the warehousing facilities will be there, and so on, so that you minimize the number of cars, large trucks, time and again going to deliver stock to urban areas or to towns, within towns. There's an assignment I've left you with here. You need to define what an urban consolidation center is, what the advantages and disadvantages of such centers are, and then critically examine whether such centers exist in Botswana and whether they can be introduced in Botswana. Thank you so much.